Okay, so thank you for asking me to talk about training routes in Britain. So in Britain, the training route to becoming a clinical neuropsychology member of the division entails that you first do a clinical training or educational psychology training at doctorate level. And then subsequent to that, you need to do roughly three years of further training in clinical neuropsychology, which concludes with a Viva, and I'll speak about that in a minute. So let's start with clinical psychology training. So generally the requirements are a good first degree in psychology, and a useful resource would be to, for example, look at our own program here, the North Wales Clinical Psychology Training Program, which is a very good training program. So they have a web page where you can see more about what the requirements are. And generally it's a good first degree plus some experience working with clinical populations, either as an assistant psychologist, which those are very difficult posts to get because of the sheer number of applicants, or similar, and that would be in a support worker role or any other volunteering or paid position where you work with patients or other clinical populations. The other thing that's probably important would be a scientist practitioner approach, so to combine research with practice and to understand how those two things inform each other. So clinical psychology draws very much on science to be able to practice. So those sort of three general areas to make a strong application. It's a good academic first degree experience and scientist practitioner. Additional to that, sometimes it's really helpful to have a postgraduate qualification, so for example a master's or a PhD will further equip you in terms of the research skills which would be required at doctoral clinical psychology training. So once one has completed clinical psychology doctoral level training, you usually end up working either in the NHS or in private practice or other hospital environments. And if the practitioner has a strong interest in neuropsychology, they would have already covered a fair amount of neuropsychology in clinical training, depending on the program. Different programs emphasize different things. Some clinical programs emphasize psychological therapy and assessment, others neuropsychology, so they cover a lot. But there's always some neuropsychology in there. So from that then, if you decide to become a clinical neuropsychologist, what you need to do is to enroll with the BPS to do the training which will make you eligible to become a member on the specialist register for clinical neuropsychology of the division. And that generally is a 3-year period of supervised practice where you've got to do a certain amount of hours of supervised practice. So you'll need to identify a supervisor who is already on the specialist register of the division. There's a component which is called the underpinning knowledge, which you can achieve in two ways. You can either go the independent route, which you study on your own and you register with the BPS as a candidate. Well, you have to register anyway. If you're an independent candidate, then you would take your exams at some point, your written exams on the underpinning knowledge, which will be things like neuroanatomy, neuropsychological rehabilitation, and so forth. And so you could take the exams, or you can enroll for a university master's level program which is accredited for the underpinning knowledge. There are very few of those in the UK. I think there are 2 or 3, depending on which stream you choose. It's either pediatric or adult. You can do both, but that obviously increases the difficulty level and the time commitment quite substantially. So if you go through the university, the MSc program, then you would finish the underpinning knowledge. So you add to that the supervised practice, and together with that you would have to submit a portfolio of clinical work, which would be 6 cases. So 6 case reports of roughly 4,000 words, if I remember correctly. Those then go with you to your viva. So the final viva, which usually occurs 2 to 3 years after qualifying as a clinical or educational psychologist. You'll be examined on the 6 cases there, plus your underpinning knowledge. If you successfully complete your viva, then you will be eligible to be on the specialist register of the Division of Clinical Neuropsychology in this country. So, just to summarize then, there are certain requirements for getting into clinical training, which is the good first degree plus the clinical experience plus other perhaps evidence of good scientist practitioner knowledge. Then your clinical training will cover some neuropsychology, but if you want to become a clinical neuropsychologist, then that will be postdoctoral. Okay, so my experience of working as a clinical neuropsychologist, I think it's one of the most fantastic jobs to do, because it integrates science, very, very good, solid science, with practice and also with humanity. So essentially the clinical neuropsychologist tends to work in assessment and rehabilitation of people with various forms of neurological illness or injury. So my own experiences, I work with acquired brain injury in adults. I have no pediatric clinical neuropsychology knowledge. So I see mostly younger to older adults with either traumatic brain injury, stroke, meningitis, encephalitis, brain tumours, and so forth. What I like most about my job is using science, as in the scientific grounding knowledge of neuroanatomy, neuropsychological testing, neuropsychological theory, and apply that to try and better the lives of patients, which is ultimately why I think most of my colleagues went into this work, which is certainly why I went into the work. There are also opportunities for research, which are excellent in clinical neuropsychology. The personal characteristics or the challenges, I think, is one has to have resilience. I think especially emotional resilience. I think you have to be prepared to work very hard. I think you have to be able to deal with ambiguity. Individuals don't always present exactly as a brain lesion might dictate, because they are individual human beings and they bring their own histories and personalities into the picture. I think in terms of having done clinical psychology training first, how that has helped me is to look at my patients beyond just a lesion or a type of illness or injury and see them within the wider context of who they are and society and their families, and in that way build up a more holistic picture of how to try and rehabilitate them. I think it's a job that requires one to be sure that this is what you want to do, given how long the training route is. But I would say that it's probably the best thing I've done in my life.